All right, man, keep your hands where I can see them. Why are you drifting lanes?
I wasn't drifting. I corrected once. Hands are right here.
Don't argue with me. I smell drugs. Step out of the car, now.
I don't consent to searches. And before
you don't get to dictate this stop. Step out or I'll make you.
I'm DEA. Badges in my jacket. You might want to slow this down.
The red and blue lights cut through the Texas night at exactly 11:43 p.m., a shoulder stop. A badge check. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. What should have been routine hardened into something dangerous when one officer said, "Step out of the vehicle," and the man inside quietly replied, "I'm federal." By sunrise, one career would be in freefall. By the end, it would cost $475,000 and expose how fragile authority becomes when ego outruns law. Stay with this story to its end. Not for the shock, but for the quiet mechanics of power, procedure, and consequence that follow one decision made on a dark roadside, and the system that had to decide who was telling the truth. The highway was nearly empty. One day, fly, AP pulled to see. The kind of late-night quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it is. Tires whispered against asphalt. A patrol SUV idled in the median, engine ticking, radar humming low. At 11:43 p.m., the computer timestamp would later confirm, the officer's eyes caught a minor infraction lane drift, subtle but enough. He pulled out smoothly, lights blooming red and blue across the dark like a reflex learned long ago. Inside the stopped vehicle, the driver eased onto the shoulder without hesitation. No sudden braking, no erratic movement. The kind of compliance officers are trained to notice, and sometimes mistrust. The officer stepped out, boots crunching gravel, body camera activating automatically policy required it the moment the emergency lights engaged. The lens blinked red. Recording. The first exchange was routine. License. Registration. A calm voice from the driver's seat, measured and flat. No tremor, no apology. The officer leaned in slightly, scanning the interior the way the academy taught him: hands, console, back seat. He inhaled, then paused. "I'm smelling narcotics," the officer said. It was delivered casually, almost conversational. But it changed everything. Under Texas law, odor could justify further detention. The words carried weight. Inside the car, the driver didn't react the way most people do. No protest, no confusion, just a slow breath. "I don't consent to any searches," he said. Then after a beat, "Before this goes any further, you should know I'm a DEA agent." Silence. The officer straightened. The air between them shifted, tightening like a wire pulled too far. Federal credentials were produced, handed out deliberately. The badge caught the patrol lights, flashing gold for half a second before disappearing back into shadow. Procedure should have taken over here. Interagency protocol was clear. Verify, notify supervisor, de-escalate. That was in the manual. Page numbers would later be cited. Instead, the officer hesitated. "I'm still investigating," he said. Short, controlled. Not loud, but firm enough to reclaim ground. "Step out of the vehicle." The agent complied, slowly. Hands visible. Training mirrored training, federal restraint meeting municipal command. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights washing over the scene like indifferent witnesses. The officer conducted a pat-down that yielded nothing. No residue, no contraband. Still, the accusation hung in the air, heavier now because it had no proof. "You saying I'm lying?" the officer asked. The question wasn't procedural. It was personal. "I'm saying there's nothing here," the agent replied. Calm, almost tired, "and this doesn't need to escalate," but it already had. The officer called it in over the radio, his voice clipped, avoiding mention of federal status in the first transmission. That omission would matter later. A supervisor acknowledged, asked for updates. Time stretched. The stop passed the point of reasonableness defined in Rodriguez v. United States, though no one said that out loud yet. Another unit arrived. More lights, more eyes. The agent stood on the shoulder, jacket pulled tight against the wind, watching authority multiply without purpose. When his phone was temporarily seized for officer safety, the officer said something inside the situation broke. Not loudly, quietly, like trust giving way. Eventually, verification came back. The credentials were real. The federal database confirmed it. The justification evaporated all at once, leaving only posture and pride standing in its place. The officer handed back the documents without apology. "You're free to go." No explanation. No acknowledgement. Just an ending that felt unfinished. The agent drove away, hands steady on the wheel, replaying the stop in his head the way trained minds do, cataloging deviations, noting timestamps, already drafting the report he was required to file under Department of Justice incident policy within 24 hours. Behind him, the patrol SUV sat idle on the shoulder, lights finally dark. The officer remained inside, staring forward, unaware that the camera on his chest had already preserved every second and that the stop wasn't over. It was only beginning. Morning came without ceremony. No sirens, no phone calls, just fluorescent light humming awake inside a federal field office, tucked behind an unmarked facade. Deliberately forgettable, deliberately quiet. The agent arrived early, as trained, as expected. Same parking space, same badge swipe, same coffee poured and left untouched. At 8:17 a.m., he opened a blank incident memorandum on a secure terminal. DOJ policy required it any law enforcement encounter that risked interference with federal duties had to be documented within 24 hours. Not for retaliation, for record, for containment, for truth preserved before memory could soften its edges. He wrote carefully. Time, location, cause for stop, language used. The phrase odor of narcotics appeared exactly once, enclosed in quotation marks, as if distance alone could drain it of power. He noted the prolonged detention past mission-neutral justification, cited calmly, almost clinically, no adjectives, no emotion. The kind of writing meant to survive discovery. When he finished, he sent it up the chain, group supervisor first, then the assistant special agent in charge. The memo disappeared into encrypted systems designed to absorb incidents without noise. Federal silence wasn't avoidance, it was insulation. Down the hall, conversation stayed low. No one asked questions they didn't need answered. Everyone understood the unwritten rule. Do not escalate across jurisdictions unless escalation is unavoidable. Federal agencies learned long ago that public friction with local departments rarely produced justice-only theater. Meanwhile, across town, the municipal department moved faster and louder. The officer submitted his report before sunrise. Body cam footage was uploaded automatically to the department's evidence management system, time-stamped and locked, at least in theory. Supervisors reviewed it in segments, not start to finish. The phrase, "I smell narcotics," raised no eyebrows. It never did. The omission of the federal identification in the initial radio call did not trigger immediate concern either. That kind of thing was explained away as stress, as judgment, as discretion. At roll call, the stop was mentioned briefly. Nothing came of it, someone said. Laughter followed. The room moved on. What no one saw was the parallel timeline forming quietly, methodically. Federal counsel reviewed the memo that afternoon. They didn't react emotionally. They reacted structurally. The question wasn't whether the stop was inappropriate. The question was exposure. Interference. Pattern. Let's wait, the ASAC said. See what they do. So they waited. Days passed. Then a week. No outreach from the department. No acknowledgement. Instead, a rumor surfaced, internal chatter, suggesting the agent had been uncooperative. The word traveled the way words always do in law enforcement circles. Sideways, unofficial, damaging. That's when restraint hardened into resolve. A civil rights attorney was retained not to threaten, but to observe. Preservation letters were drafted, requesting all records related to the stop. Body cam, dash cam, CAD logs, training certifications. The letters were polite, professional, and possible to ignore. Inside the department, the tone changed. Emails multiplied. A supervisor requested clarification from the officer. Another asked why the stop extended beyond 8 minutes without new articulable suspicion. Someone else noticed the radio log discrepancy. Silence gave way to unease. The officer felt it first in the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, in the way a lieutenant reread his report twice instead of once, in the way the body cam footage, once background noise, became a mirror no one wanted to look into. Still, no one apologized. No one reached out. Federal silence continued not as absence, but as pressure. Every day without acknowledgement deepened the record. Every unchecked statement became harder to defend. This wasn't retaliation. It was gravity. Late one evening, the agent received a call from his attorney. Short, measured. "They've requested depositions," she said. "That means they know this isn't going away." The agent looked out his window at a city that felt unchanged. Streetlights, traffic, distance. He thought about the moment on the shoulder when authority tried to outrun law and how quietly the consequences were now assembling. Somewhere across town, the officer sat alone in his patrol car, scrolling his phone, unaware that silence on both sides had already sealed the next phase. The deposition room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier toner, the kind of neutral space designed to drain emotion from truth. A rectangular table, a recorder placed dead center. At 9:02 a.m., the court reporter adjusted her headset and asked everyone to state their names for the record. Voices followed flat, professional, already defensive. The officer went first. He sat upright, uniform pressed, hands folded as if posture alone could reinforce certainty. His attorney nodded occasionally, a quiet metronome of reassurance. The questions began gently: background, years of service, certifications completed. He answered without hesitation. Traffic enforcement, probable cause, officer safety. The language of training flowed easily, practiced and smooth. Then the questions narrowed. "Can you describe what led you to believe you smelled narcotics?" The officer paused. "Not long. Just long enough to be noticed." "It was strong," he said. "Distinct. Consistent with my experience." "How many narcotics-related arrests have you made in the past year?" He gave a number. It was written down. "Have you received any refresher training on odor-based probable cause since the academy?" Another pause. This one longer. "I don't recall." The agent's deposition followed that afternoon in a different building. Quieter, colder. He spoke less. When he did, his answers were precise, anchored to time and policy. He referenced Rodriguez versus in United States without naming it, only the rule. A stop cannot be prolonged without independent justification. He didn't accuse. He described. "When my phone was taken, the stop exceeded its original purpose," he said. "At that point, I knew protocol had failed." No one interrupted him. As transcripts came in, attorneys began laying them side by side, words aligned, then didn't. The officer claimed the smell was immediate. Body cam showed nearly 2 minutes of conversation before it was mentioned. He said the agent appeared nervous. Video showed steady hands. He said backup was requested due to uncertainty. Radio logs revealed no mention of federal credentials until later. Small gaps. But gaps are where cases breathe. Internal Affairs opened a formal review, triggered not by accusation, but by inconsistency. Training records were pulled. The officer's last legal update on search and seizure was 4 years old policy recommended annual refreshers. Supervisors were interviewed. One admitted carefully that federal encounters were rare and guidance was mostly informal. Emails surfaced. Not incriminating, just casual. A message sent minutes after the stop ended. "Pulled over a Fed tonight. Thought he was dirty." It was meant as humor. It landed as bias. The officer was called back for clarification. "Why didn't you notify your supervisor immediately after learning he was federal?" the investigator asked. "I was still investigating," he replied. Same phrase, same tone, but you had no evidence. "I had my training." Training, it turned out, was the weakest part of the defense. Experts were consulted, retired commanders, use of force instructors, legal scholars. They didn't debate intent, they debated procedure. And procedure, when violated, doesn't care why. Outside the room, the officer's confidence began to thin. Not crack. Thin. He reread his report at night, noticing phrases he hadn't noticed before. How absolute they sounded. How little room they left for correction. The agent, meanwhile, waited. Federal silence again. Not passive. Strategic. His career continued uninterrupted, but something in him stayed on that shoulder, alert now to how easily authority could mistake resistance for guilt. When prosecutors declined criminal charges, the announcement landed quietly. No press conference, no vindication, just a line in an email. Insufficient evidence to pursue criminal action. For the officer, it felt like relief. For the city's legal department, it felt like danger. Because criminal immunity didn't shield civil liability. That reality arrived in the form of a lawsuit draft circulated internally late one Friday afternoon. Claims were specific, narrow, painfully documented. Fourth Amendment violation, unlawful detention, interference with federal duties. The officer read it alone at his kitchen table, the house silent around him. He reached the last page, where damages were listed not as punishment, but as consequence. For the first time, the question wasn't whether he was right. It was how much being wrong was going to cost. The civil case moved at a different speed, slower, heavier, deliberate. Gone were the quick judgments and instinctive calls of the roadside. This was weight, paper weight, calendar weight, the kind that settled into shoulders and stayed there. Discovery began quietly. Subpoenas for records, requests for policies, training logs, complaint histories. Nothing dramatic, just accumulation. Each document another grain of sand tipping the balance. The city's legal department assembled a timeline on a conference room wall: photos, timestamps, excerpts blown up and taped straight. When viewed alone, none of it looked fatal. Together, it told a story no one wanted to defend. The officer was deposed again, this time with the city's attorneys watching closely. Their posture had changed. Less loyalty, more distance. They asked questions not to protect him, but to assess risk. You understand that qualified immunity doesn't apply if clearly established law was violated? One attorney asked. Yes, he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it once had. And you're aware that prolonged detention without new articulable suspicion has been clearly established since 2015? He nodded. The date landed hard. Rodriguez v. United States, now spoken aloud, no longer abstract. The agent's attorneys didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They let the video speak. Frame by frame, minute by minute. They paused the footage where the officer's tone shifted, zoomed in where the radio transmission omitted critical context, played back the moment the phone was taken. No threat, no justification, just control. Authority, stripped of narrative. Looked different on screen. Behind closed doors, the city's risk management team ran numbers. Past settlements, jury tendencies, federal plaintiff optics. They knew the danger of letting a jury decide whether a local officer had overstepped against a federal agent with documentation, restraint, and credibility on his side. Insurance carriers were notified. Coverage limits were reviewed. Adjusters asked the same question in different ways. Can this be defended? No one answered confidently. The officer felt the shift in the smallest ways. His schedule changed. He was reassigned off patrol pending outcome. Administrative necessity, they called it. Colleagues stopped asking how the case was going. Supervisors stopped making eye contact. The badge still weighed the same, but it felt heavier now, like it carried debt. At home, he read forums, searched similar cases late into the night. Officers in other cities, other stops, other moments where discretion had slipped into assumption. Settlements ranged wildly. Some careers survived. Others ended quietly, without ceremony. Negotiations began in a downtown office overlooking the courthouse. Long table, neutral walls, no raised voices, just lawyers trading hypotheticals dressed as certainty. The city wanted it closed. The agent wanted accountability, not symbolic but procedural. Policy changes, his attorney said calmly. Training requirements. Written acknowledgement. The city agreed. Quickly. Then came the number. It was placed on the table without flourish. $475,000. Not punitive. Calculated. Painful enough to matter. Manageable enough to avoid trial. The officer heard about it last. Always last now. When he did, the number echoed louder than sirens ever had. It wasn't his money, not directly, but he understood the meaning. Settlements leave fingerprints. Promotions stall. Files thicken. Futures narrow. He thought back to the question he'd asked on the shoulder. You saying I'm lying? The answer, it turned out, was more complex than yes or no. Authority had a price, and someone was about to pay it. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of administrative day that rarely carries emotional weight until it does. No courtroom, no judge, just signatures exchanged through secure portals and a press release drafted to say as little as possible. The city did not admit wrongdoing. The officer was not named in the headline. The number $475,000 appeared once, then disappeared into public records where consequences tend to live quietly. Policy changes followed within weeks. Not announced, just implemented. A revised traffic stop protocol circulated department-wide, clarifying interagency encounters in language that left no room for improvisation. Mandatory annual legal refreshers were scheduled, with emphasis on detention limits and documentation standards. Supervisors were required to review extended stops within 24 hours. Small adjustments, necessary ones, the kind that only arrive after something breaks. The agent returned to work without ceremony. No commendation, no apology letter. Federal silence again, but this time, it felt complete. His file reflected the incident, then moved on. Colleagues treated him the same, though some listened more closely when he spoke about discretion, about how authority feels different when you're standing alone on a shoulder with nothing but policy to protect you. At night, he still remembered the lights. Not fear, just awareness. The knowledge that professionalism doesn't always shield you from assumption, and that justice, when it comes, often arrives long after the moment has passed. The officer resigned 3 months later. The department framed it as a personal decision. No disciplinary termination, no public reckoning. He turned in his badge quietly, the metal catching light one last time before disappearing into a drawer. He took a job outside law enforcement private sector, fewer uniforms, less authority. Friends said he seemed calmer, quieter. Sometimes he replayed the stop in his head, not to argue it anymore, just to understand where he'd stopped listening, where procedure had given way to instinct and instinct to ego. He didn't think of himself as malicious. Most officers don't. That realization that harm doesn't require intent stayed with him. Across the city, the highway remained unchanged. Cars still drifted lanes, patrol units still waited in medians. Traffic stops still began with flashing lights and unknown endings. But somewhere in the system, a margin had shifted. A pause had been built in. A line clarified. Justice didn't feel like victory to anyone involved. It felt like exhaustion, like paperwork completed at last, like a quiet understanding that systems don't correct themselves through outrage, but through record, review, and consequence. The case faded from headlines within days. Another entry in a database. Another settlement number cited in training sessions. Recruits would hear about it years later, framed as a lesson, stripped of faces, but the lesson would remain the same. Authority is borrowed, not owned. And when it's misused, even briefly, the cost travels farther than the moment itself. Long after the lights fade, what remains isn't blame. It's the imprint left behind, and whether anyone learns to see it before the next stop begins.